was once a tower in the hidden history of Elden Ring that even its creators, for a little while, seem to have named in the language of Babel. That detail matters more than it first appears to. Babel is not only a tower, it is an ambition, it is a people looking upward and believing, with all the force of certainty, that height can become holiness if only stone. Ritual and desire are arranged in the proper shape. When we carry that image into the realm of shadow and place it beside Enir-Ilim, the white sacred city begins to glow with a different kind of meaning. It is no longer only a difficult final ascent or a pale structure suspended high above a secret landscape. It becomes a civilization's prayer made architectural. It becomes the body of a belief. It becomes the highest expression of a people convinced they were born nearer than others to the oldest sacred current of life. If you imagine Enir-Ilim by night, the comparison grows stronger. The tower does not simply rise, it hovers in the mind. White bark and pale stone gather the little light that reaches them and return it in a softer form. The paths spiral, the heights seem to disappear into their own mist. The air around the place feels old enough to remember the shape of prayers, spoken there long before the current order of the world had settled into gold. Grace and law. Nothing about the city suggests ordinary function, even when one tries to think of practical things. Stairways, terraces, doors, bridges, guardians. The place resists becoming merely practical. It insists on being symbolic. It insists on being theological. It insists on being the material shape of a people's idea of ascent. And yet the most haunting thing about Enir-Ilim is not its height alone. It is the confidence implied by its existence. Someone believed this could be done. Someone believed the path upward was real. Someone believed the body, the tree, the spiral, the horn, the ash, and the tower might all belong to the same old, divine grammar. That someone, or rather those someones, were the Hornsent, a people who looked at the signs of the body and saw not disorder, not impurity, not some regrettable excess of untamed life, but proof, evidence, nearness, primacy. The Hornsent did not merely live in the shadow of old symbols. They built with them, they arranged their society, their rites, their architecture, and perhaps even their sense of destiny around the conviction that they stood close to the earliest state of life, close to the crucible, close to what the world had been before later. Ages learned to divide, sort, discipline, and rename everything. Their tower was therefore never just a city, it was a continuation of their body theology in monumental form. It was what happens when a people do not only wear their religion, but try to raise it upward into the sky. There is something almost unbearably beautiful in that for a moment, before the sadness comes. A white spiral city, in the old dark horned figures, moving along high terraces, wind circling the upper paths, ash, or pollen or pale dust, settling over stone and bark alike. The sense that the whole place has been built, not to dominate the landscape, but to answer it, to continue something already present in tree, storm, beast, and flesh. If you look at Enir-Ilim long enough in the imagination, it begins to feel less like an urban center and more like a sacred organism, a cultivated continuation of the world's earliest attempts to touch heaven. But Babel is not a word of pure triumph. It is a warning word. It contains pride, yes, but also confusion, reversal, dispersal, and the strange way in which success can become disaster when the divine answers differently than expected. And that is why the code name matters so much here. It tells us, before we understand the details, what sort of mood this story will finally carry. Not victory, not simple holiness, but aspiration that goes too far, or perhaps succeeds too well, and in succeeding becomes the instrument of its own undoing. If we rush into the details too quickly, the tower becomes dense. There are horns and primordial life, and wild invocation, and bear hunters, and divine birds, and lion dances, and sacred ash, and shaman flesh and jars, and a gate made from the logic of mingled life, and a god who rises only to veil the place that raised her. It is too much to hold all at once. So tonight, we will not hold it all at once. We will move more gently than that. We will stay with the tower for a little while longer. We will let the image settle, a pale sacred height in the old hidden land, a city of spirals, a people who believed their bodies, their rights, and their architecture all spoke the same ancient language. Because once that language begins to unfold, everything else follows from it. Before we go farther, let your own room remain your room. Let the present stay kindly around you. The tower will remain at a distance, even as the story enters it. Nothing in the realm of shadow can touch you now. The old rites cannot close over you. The ash will not settle on your hands. The high white bark of Enir-Ilim will remain where it belongs. In story, in lore, in the soft dark of imagination. You do not need to climb the tower tonight. You do not need to prove anything to it. You only need to listen. That matters because this is one of those Elden Ring stories that can easily become too sharp if handled the wrong way. There are body horrors here. There are betrayals. There are rituals involving flesh, blindness, ecstatic grief, and the dangerous conviction that one's people stand nearest to the first and holiest form of life. There are old ceremonies beneath pale trees. There are signs of death worked back into sacred architecture. There is a god who ascends through the path made by one culture, and then leaves that culture behind in veiled obscurity. These are heavy things, but they do not need to arrive heavily. They can arrive as distant shapes. They can arrive through ash and wind and white bark, and the quiet voices of old things remembered slowly. So let the pace stay slow. If a part of the story darkens, we will return to the tower itself, to the pale terraces, to the soft drift of ash, to the wind moving high around sacred walls, to the image of spirals rising against the old sky. The tower can hold that function for us tonight. It can be both mystery and refuge, both question and return. There is a particular softness to ancient structures imagined at a distance, when we are not inside them, not fighting through them, not forcing them to yield explanation. They become almost dreamlike. Enir-Ilim is one of those places. It is too pale, too high, too symbolically charged to feel entirely real in the ordinary sense. It is more like a memory the world is trying not to forget, or a thought held so long by stone that stone has begun to resemble thought. If you let yourself imagine it, only in outlines, a tower among clouds, a city of bark and light and ash, it becomes easier to understand why the Hornsent would have believed in it so deeply. Because there is a kind of architecture that does not only shelter life, it expresses what a civilization thinks life is for. A granary says one thing, a fortress says another, a market says another still. And Enir-Ilim says ascent. It says sacred nearness. It says that there are people beneath the tower who believe the world remains open upward, if only the right shape is found and the right rites are carried through. It says they have not accepted distance from the divine as final, and that refusal, quiet and total, is already enough to make the whole story feel tragic long before we know exactly why. For now then, keep only that feeling, a tower reaching where it should not perhaps reach, a chosen people certain of their rightness, a spiral form repeating through bark, horn, and belief. The rest can wait a little longer. The rest can arrive slowly. That is the right way into old lore when the lore itself concerns ascent. We will not leap. We will circle upward, and so, gently, we come to the people who built the tower. The Hornsent believed they were chosen, and the proof of that chosenness seemed to them to live openly upon the body. Horns were not merely growths, they were signs. They were not treated as deformities, not in their own old sacred language. They were evidence that life had not fully drifted away from its earlier state. Tangled horns especially were revered, and that detail is important because tangled growth is not the kind of thing a later, more orderly aesthetic usually prizes. The Hornsent were not seeking purity in the sense of clean lines or calm forms. They were seeking proximity. The more visibly a body recalled the entangled abundance of the beginning, the more spiritually significant the body became. In a later age, horns and crucible aspects would often be treated with discomfort or contempt, associated with disorder, with excessive life, with the parts of creation that the Erdtree's age preferred to keep hidden, controlled, or relegated to the past. But the Hornsent were old enough, or at least inwardly oriented enough, to understand those same traits very differently. They looked backward toward the beginning, and saw holiness there. What later worlds might call regression, they called remembrance. What later worlds would dismiss as wild excess, they called sacred nearness. This is why the idea of primacy matters so much. Primacy in the Hornsent worldview is not merely political seniority. It is not just the claim that they were first in sequence. It is the claim that they stood closest to the first condition of life, closest to the moment before living forms had fully separated from one another, closest to the crucible, that dense primordial state in which life mingled, overlapped, and contained within itself many aspects that later ages would pull apart. A horned body, therefore, becomes more than a biological curiosity. It becomes a theological argument. You can almost feel how a people might arrange their entire culture around that belief. Imagine childhood in such a world. Horns are not embarrassing. They are watched, measured, interpreted. A child born with stronger signs may be understood as carrying more of the old sacred current than another. Tangled growth becomes auspicious. The body itself becomes a text. Priests, dancers, warriors, and guardians all stand within a culture in which anatomy can signify destiny. This does not create humility. It creates hierarchy charged with sanctity. The chosen are not only socially elevated, they are cosmologically validated. And because this chosenness is written into the body, it also becomes self-reinforcing. The people who benefit from such a theology have little reason to doubt it. The more their architecture, ritual, and myth gather around horns as sacred signs, the more inevitable the whole system begins to feel. Their tower rises not merely because they wish to build something grand, but because a culture convinced of its nearness to divine beginnings will always seek to give that conviction monumental form. The beauty of the Hornsent world lies partly in how consistent it is on its own terms. The horror lies there too. If horns mean closeness to primordial life, and primordial life means sacred nearness, then everything else begins to sort itself accordingly. Those nearer the old state become more important. The body becomes evidence of rank, and if one carries this logic far enough, one arrives not only at reverence, but at experiment, ritual, exclusion, and eventually violence in service to the same sacred ideal. Still, at this stage in the story, it is worth remaining with the wonder before the wonder. Cruelty. Imagine the light in Belliret, touching carved horns and white bark. Imagine the wind running around old towers and sacred platforms. Imagine priests and horned warriors who truly believed they were standing inside a world where the divine had not yet retreated behind impossible distance. That faith, however dangerous, has its own austere beauty. It is the beauty of people who think the body still speaks the language of creation clearly enough to be trusted. And behind that body language lies the crucible, to understand why the Hornsent revere tangled life instead of fearing it. We have to step gently into Elden Ring's deeper creation myth, not to solve it absolutely, but to feel the shape of it. There is the one great, remembered in fragments and implication. There is the fracture from which distinction emerges. There is the greater will, or at least a force by which order, stars, and the conditions of the world become separable enough to be named. None of these things is explained with the comforting clarity of a textbook. They are more like distant bells sounding through lore. But one thing remains emotionally clear. The world begins not in neatness, but in density, in abundance, in intermingling. The Crucible is the memory of that, or perhaps not only the memory, but the lingering presence of that old state in earthly life. It is primal life before differentiation settles. It is growth before refinement. It is life as a thick and potent mixture. When horns appear, when tails and scales and feathers emerge, when life seems to carry more than one line of becoming at once, the Crucible is close. Later orders may prefer bounded categories. The Crucible prefers overflow. This is why gold in Crucible incantations feels so important. Gold is not foreign to the primordial. The later Erdtree age would present gold as the sign of divine order. But the root of order does not float above older life untouched. It emerges from it. The Hornsent, in their own way, seem to understand that continuity. They do not reject divinity. They reject the idea that divinity begins with late order. For them, the sacred begins earlier, where life is messier, richer, less decided. There is a kind of humility hidden in that. though it becomes tangled with pride. The humility lies in recognizing that humanity is not the center of sacred form. Beasts, birds, scales, storms, all are closer to the beginning than civilized certainty is. But pride enters the moment a people begin to say, not only that the old abundance is sacred, but that they, by virtue of their horns and bodies, stand uniquely close to it. The Hornsent do both. They revere the old state sincerely. They also claim special access to it. That combination produces one of the most compelling religious temperaments in all of Elden Ring, half reverence, half superiority. If you linger with the Crucible long enough, it starts to feel less like a doctrine and more like a climate. A way the world once was everywhere before it became sorted. The body bore multiple possibilities at once. The animal and the human were not sealed apart so tightly. Storm and beast and flesh still overlapped in sacred understanding. A civilization oriented toward that climate would not pursue clean transcendence. It would pursue immersion, not escape from the mixed state, but deeper participation in it. That, I think, is what the Hornsent sought. They did not want to leave the primal behind. They wanted to climb through it. It is an extraordinary aspiration when seen in a softened light. A people not praying to become less bodily, but more cosmically bodily. More representative of the earlier state, more open to life's original density. The tower becomes clearer in this context. It is not trying to purify life into abstract spirit. It is trying to organize life's sacred abundance into a path upward. The spiral is the perfect symbol for that, not a straight line of purified ascent, but a turning, returning movement, circling and rising through its own repetitions. Once we understand that, the Hornsent's fascination with the wild becomes easier to follow. One of the most beautiful and revealing little stories in the DLC is the story of Red Bear. On the surface, it is simple enough. A man fights a great red bear. He survives. But survival is not the true outcome. Revelation is. Something in that contest alters his sense of self so thoroughly that the old name begins to loosen from him. He wants to be a bear, no more and no less. That desire would sound absurd in a flatter world. In the realm of shadow, it sounds like the beginning of a sacred recognition. The bear matters because it represents a form of life that has not learned to apologize for itself. It is strength without ceremony. It is appetite and force in a body fully suited to them. It does not need doctrinal sanction to be glorious. Red Bear sees this and becomes fascinated. In another genre, he would merely admire the beast. Here admiration becomes transformation. He does not want to own the power. He wants to participate in the mode of being that carries it so naturally. This is why the story belongs beside Hornsent theology. The old sacred does not live only in towers and rites. It lives in the rawness of the world. It lives where a creature can express its nature without refinement. To confront such a being and survive is to stand in front of a revelation about what strength looked like before civilization learned to dress it in moral language. Red Bear's loss of his old name is therefore not simple madness. It is a renunciation of a smaller identity in favor of a larger and more primordial one, or at least what feels larger and more primordial in the heat of revelation. And this is exactly the emotional register that later helps divine invocation make sense. The wild is not merely a thing to overcome, it is a medium through which the Ganast self-discovers its hidden god. Battle with the beast does not simply produce victory. It produces recognition. The inside answers the outside. A primal form meets a body already capable of being altered by it. Suddenly the line between what one is and what one could invoke begins to thin. There is something almost gentle in the sadness of Red Bear too. To forget one's own name is not a small thing. It means the old social self has loosened. It means the categories by which the world once recognized you no longer feel sufficient. Wild revelation is beautiful, but it is also costly. It strips, it replaces, it asks the person to become less intelligible in ordinary terms. This will matter later, because so many of the shadowed sacred transformations in this story carry that cost. One sees something deeper, and becomes harder to fit inside a normal life afterward. For now, though, we can stay with the image, a red bear in the old wild, a man who survives the struggle, and comes away loving what nearly destroyed him. The wild in Elden Ring does not always act as enemy. Sometimes it acts as invitation. Divine Invocation is one of the most fascinating phrases in the entire DLC, because it names a spiritual technology without exhausting. At a glance, it resembles Dragon Communion. There is confrontation, subjugation, contact with something powerful and more than human. Yet the emotional shape is different. Dragon Communion feels acquisitive. One hunts, consumes, and gradually becomes the thing one thought one was mastering. Divine Invocation feels less like theft and more like awakening through encounter. The language that only through battle with the feral wild can one discover a god unique to oneself is astonishing. It suggests that divinity is not only out there in the beast, it is waiting in the self, dormant or unshaped, until the right violent recognition occurs. The beast is therefore not merely an external source of power. It is a key, a mirror, a challenge that pulls some hidden principle into visibility. This differs from later, more orderly forms of religion in a profound way. There is no simple moral lesson. There is no neat hierarchy in which the divine descends in a controlled fashion through sanctioned ritual alone. The wild must be met. The body must be risked. Fear, force, and revelation coexist. One does not become fit for divine invocation by being protected from life's feral edges. One becomes fit by entering them. For the Hornsent, this must have felt almost natural. Their horns already spoke of the Crucible. Their bodies already carried visible signs of the primordial abundance they revered. They were, in a sense, born with media for invocation. But the principle reaches beyond them. Red Bear discovers it through the bear. Other figures discover it through birds, lions, storms, or old sacred beasts. The world of the Shadow Realm is full of these half-lost interfaces between body and the more primal forms of life. The beauty of divine invocation is that it refuses to separate spirituality from embodiment. One does not transcend the body to become more divine. One drives farther into the body, into conflict, into risk, into old forms, and finds there a God waiting. This fits the Hornsent worldview perfectly. Their whole culture resists the later tendency to define sacredness through distance from mixture, animality, and force. They find sanctity nearer to those things, not farther from them. It is worth pausing over the phrase unique to oneself. There is intimacy in that. The divine is not encountered as a generic universal abstraction. It is personal in a very strange way, not because it flatters individuality in the modern sense, but because each body, each confrontation, each wild threshold may awaken a different sacred answer. This makes the old world of the Hornsent and their neighbors feel enormous in spiritual possibility. No wonder they built towers. A people living inside such a theology would not easily believe that the gods had finished speaking. And from this broader field of wild sacredness, we move toward the Highlands and toward the figure who will later stand at the hinge between old wild power and the coming age of order. The Highland warriors preserve a form of sacred wildness that feels adjacent to the Hornsent without being identical to them. They are hunters of bears. They glorify physical contest. They define prestige through the subjugation of savage beasts. Theirs is not the quiet theology of a tower, but the body theology of open land, scarred skin, hard breath, and force proved against what cannot be reasoned with. This makes them especially important when thinking about Hoarah Loux. Hoarah Loux feels less and less like an isolated mythic brute the more one traces these threads. The Highland axe beneath his portrait, the warrior on the axe talisman, the old associations with bear hunting, the red tassels, the roars, the whole world of bodily supremacy from which his early image emerges, all of it suggests a cultural horizon in which wildness and sacred vitality still stood close to one another. He does not need to be Hornsent to matter deeply to Hornsent theology. He belongs to a neighboring sacred grammar, one in which the old uncivilized force of life is still glorious rather than shameful. Imagine Hoarah Loux before crowns and before the language of lordship has disciplined him. A man in open ground, a body carrying scars honestly, breath clouding in cold air. A roar that feels less like theatrical aggression and more like a direct release of being. Around him, perhaps, the old world of hunters, beasts, and the weather itself. Such a figure would be legible to the Hornsent, in a way many later heroes would not be. He is not refined, he is not separated from the body, he is not trying to hide the wild beneath ceremonial calm. He is proof that power can still appear in forms closer to the beginning. This is why the Hornsent garments that seem to honor a near-naked hero from an older age matter so much. They suggest reverence, perhaps even nostalgia. They tell us that the Hornsent did not only value horns on themselves, they could admire in others a bodily closeness to the older world they love. Hoarah Loux or someone like him would have seemed part of that sacred perimeter. Then comes the transformation into Godfrey. This is one of those quiet shifts in Elden Ring that carry entire ages inside them. Hoarah Loux does not vanish. He is disciplined, crowned, brought into relation with a new order that values conquest, lineage, and divine authority shaped under the Ur tree. He accepts the role. He accepts the sap. He becomes a lord not only of strength, but of organized order. In doing so, he crosses the line that separates primal power from sanctioned sovereignty. To the Hornsent, this could only have felt double-edged. At first, perhaps, they had hope. If such a man stood beside Marika, then maybe the old world of beast near divinity would survive inside the new one. But later, lore suggests that this hope would fade. Godfrey did not hold open the old path. He became one of the pillars of a system that would eventually regard the Crucible's older abundance with discomfort or contempt. The wild hero joined the age that narrows the meaning of holiness. That sadness belongs quietly beneath everything that follows. The Hornsent did not misread only abstract divine currents. They also misread people, or perhaps people changed under crowns. A hero from the old world became useful to the new one, and in becoming useful, ceased to be a path back for those who had admired him. Ornis stands at a more luminous point in the story. He tamed the divine bird and made its wings his own. This is one of those small sentences in Elden Ring that opens a huge chamber of implication. He does not simply wear feathers in imitation. He does not simply pray to a bird from below. He invokes it. He becomes the vessel in which avian divinity takes temporary bodily form. It is a beautiful image to rest in for a while. A high terrace, pale light, a horned or disciplined warrior standing ready. The divine bird not descending as symbol, but as force. Wings opening not above him, but through him, Ornis lifted, altered, made briefly into something more than a single bounded body. This is not the theological mood of distance. This is the theological mood of participation. Divinity enters through the body. The self is widened by hosting something not wholly itself. Later he falls and remains as a guardian, but even that does not diminish the glow of his role. He becomes a memory of what invocation can do when it succeeds. He is a bridge between the Hornsent's bodily sacred signs and their larger ceremonial ambition. Through Ornis, one sees that their religion is not only about admiring the primordial. It is about hosting it, being crossed by it, becoming momentarily coextensive with forces that properly belong to a higher sphere. The phrase higher sphere matters. It implies a cosmology with layers. The Hornsent are below, yes, but not resigned to below. They know there are beings above. They believe contact is possible. The tower itself will later become the greatest expression of this belief. But Ornis already proves that ascent does not need only architecture. It can happen in the body too. One prepared body, one ritual, one act of invocation, and the boundary thins. Because this is a sleep story, we can let the image remain longer than analysis requires. Think of feathers moving in the wind high above the land. Think of the hush before a sacred act. Think of the body bracing not for pain, but for presence. Think of the moment the divine bird is no longer elsewhere. That tenderness of concentration, that dangerous beauty, belongs to Ornis, and through him to the whole lost spiritual world of Enir-Ilim. From Ornis, the path rises into one of the strangest ceremonial chains in the Shadow Realm. Horned warriors, divine beast warriors, sculpted keepers. The lion dance. Each stage brings the old Hornsent principle into a fuller and more embodied expression. Horned warriors use their horns as media of storm. Their bodies and their armaments become channels for a weather-linked divinity. The divine beast warriors go farther. They no longer merely gesture toward the sacred beast. They are honored as those who stand closer to it, and then, at the highest ceremonial threshold, the sculpted keepers host the lion dance itself, allowing a wrathful sacred power from a higher sphere to take root within them. Take root is such a revealing phrase. It suggests growth, inhabitation, planting. The divine beast is not hovering outside them like a projection. It settles within. The keeper becomes a cultivated vessel. The dance is therefore not performance in the shallow sense. It is ceremony as possession. It is sacred ferocity made visible. It is weather, wrath, motion, and divinity, all passing through bodies, prepared to bear them. The lion dance has a quality of ecstatic danger that perfectly fits the Hornsent world. It is neither tranquil nor purely destructive. It is cleansing through violence, sacred through excess, beautiful through its very inability to remain calm. The people watching such a thing at festival would not have thought they were merely being entertained. They were witnessing the old current move. The divine beast came down, the higher sphere touched the lower, the boundary between human, animal, and sacred force loosened for a while. That is what they valued. No wonder later ages, more orderly and more cautious, would find such things difficult to integrate. The lion dance is too wild to be an ornament. It is too physical to be abstracted fully. It belongs to a world where sanctity still erupts. That is the world the Hornsent loved, a world not of calm moral perfection, but of dangerous contact. They did not want safety from the sacred. They wanted proximity to it, even if proximity meant fury. If you imagine the festival long enough, it becomes almost dreamlike. Great lion forms moving through mist and ash, horns sounding, the tower high above, people below watching in reverence, cloth, storm, and muscle, all becoming one spectacle of divine arrival. And under all of it, the belief that such ceremonies were not symbolic substitutes, but actual points of contact between life below and powers above. This is the civilization that built Enir-Ilim, not a people of cold philosophers only, but a people of embodied theology, of festivals, of storm calling, of sacred beasts, of bodily nearness to the old divine wild. Their tower must therefore be read in that context. It is a lion dance made monumental, a horn made architectural, a body extended into city form. The old world of wild divine nearness cannot remain untouched, once the Erdtree's order gathers itself. This is where a certain sickness enters the story, not only physical, but metaphysical. The divine beast had later becomes a source of nausea, when paired with later sacred substances. The earlier world and the later world do not merge gently. Their sacreds are related, yes, but not compatible without strain. This strain is one of the more subtle tragedies of the DLC. The Hornsent were not worshipping some wholly unrelated universe. The Crucible and the later order are tied at the root. Yet the later order does not know how to honor the old abundance without also fearing it. The same sacred origin that once produced mixed and tangled forms becomes, under order, something to regulate, subordinate, or look back on with unease. Godfrey is part of this turn. He does not waver. He receives the sap. He stands as Lord within an age that increasingly defines sacred legitimacy through the Erdtree, and not through proximity to primordial intermixture. His old wild strength is not erased, but it is repurposed. This matters because the Hornsent could once have looked at him and hoped for continuity. Instead they find in him proof that the new age can absorb old power and then deny the world from which that power first rose. That is what makes order so difficult in Elden Ring. It often incorporates what it later suppresses, it uses what it later shames. It crowns what it later distances itself from. The Hornsent Tower exists at the threshold of that reversal. Soon what they revere will be rendered archaic. Soon what they call nearness will be called contamination or chaos. But before that happens fully, the tower still stands. The rites still continue. The path still seems open, that fragile interim. When the old and new sacreds still touch without having yet fully severed one another, is one of the most haunting moods in the whole story. Enir-Ilim's whiteness deserves more time. Pale bark, pale stone, pale carved surfaces rising in spirals and layered terraces. the whole place almost like a forest turned into architecture without losing its first memory of growth. It is important that the tower does not look like a fortress in the ordinary sense. It looks like a sacred vertical ecosystem. Wood resembles stone. Stone resembles bark. The distinction between built and grown softens. This is no accident. The Hornsent seem to have understood that the most divine structures should imitate the movement of living sacred forms, especially the spiral. If you imagine standing below it at dusk, the tower does not merely rise upward. It seems to coil. A straight wall would imply command. A spiral implies participation in a current. The current of the Crucible, according to Hornsent understanding, could one day form a column to the gods. That means the tower is not only shaped correctly, it is a wager that sacred motion can be stabilized, enlarged, and made inhabitable by a people who already believe themselves close enough to use it. There is something so moving in that ambition, a civilization trying not to preserve the past only, but to continue it. Not content with receiving signs in the body, but building a larger body through which those signs might become a road. This is why the Babel comparison remains emotionally right, even if the cosmologies differ. Both are stories about height, as theology. Both are stories about human or semi-human beings trying to materialize their confidence in a form that reaches heaven. The pale bark of the tower also gives it a dream quality, perfect for bedtime lore. It is not the black stone of a dungeon, it is not the bright gold of a capital. It is a softer, stranger color, almost ghostly, as if the city were made from the memory of trees rather than from trees themselves. That softness matters because it prevents the story from becoming only brutal. The tower is terrible in what it hides, but beautiful in what it appears to be. That duality is what makes it unforgettable. Imagine the upper paths nearly empty, ash drifting, a hush so broad that footsteps become ceremonial even when no ritual is intended. Somewhere a tutelary figure keeping watch, somewhere beyond, the divine gate waiting in silence. The tower keeps all of it, the ambition, the beauty, the future betrayal, within the same pale vertical calm. The trees within Enir-Ilim and around Belurat give the whole place its deepest atmosphere. Trees in Elden Ring are never neutral, they are memory. Order, ancestry, burial, and sacred economy all at once. The white spiral trees around Belurat reflect the Hornsent's older reverence for the Crucible current. The golden trees within Enir-Ilim add another layer. They feel nourished, fed. Their bark carries forms within it, especially feminine ones, as if life has not merely passed through them, but been retained by them. This is where the idea of sacred recycling becomes crucial. Euphoria, fashioned from golden shoots, recovers its lost luster by dealing damage. That alone tells us that life and sacred brilliance are linked through exchange, through contact, through taking. The tower's trees seem to participate in a similar economy. They are not simply ornaments of paradise, they are the visible result of a ritual environment in which life's remains continue working. Ash is the bridge, revered spirit. Ash collects in the hands of tutelary deities. Old funerary practices involving ghost flame imply cremation. Boats carry the dead. The dead are not merely removed. They are transformed. Their remains become spiritually charged matter. Once we understand that, Enir-Ilim begins to look like a place where the dead were intentionally worked back into sacred growth. The ash falls softly, but it does not feel empty. It feels occupied by memory. Picture a high terrace after ceremony. The air is pale with floating ash. Below, old fires have done their work. Nearby, sacred figures hold the remains in their palms. Trees continue to grow in that same environment, their gold nourished by what was once living. It is almost serene if you do not think too quickly about the bodies that preceded the ash. The Hornsent may have found great comfort in such a cycle. Death is not discarded, death is returned. Life becomes sacred material for the next ascent. This gives the tower a strange gentleness despite its severity. It becomes a place where the dead still help, the living reach upward. A crematory theology turned into arboreal architecture. A holy city dusted in the very remains that continue to sustain it. It is dark. It is also deeply beautiful. Elden Ring loves that mixture, where reverence and unease are not enemies but companions. The ailing village then becomes a warning image within the same system. Here the dead are mishandled. They are not transformed properly. They are thrown aside. Flies bloom. Sickness spreads. Some become flymen. What should have been ritual becomes neglect. The contrast clarifies the Hornsent worldview. Proper transformation of death matters. Without it, the environment itself is spiritually poisoned. With it, death can nourish sacred continuity. In this light, the tower's ash is not incidental. It is doctrinal. It is what correct death looks like when folded back into a civilization's holy center. And once that is understood, the next step into jars and shamans becomes even more terrible. It is worth slowing for a moment beside the village of flies, because places of lesser scale often reveal the rules of a world more clearly than its greatest monuments do. The village feels wrong in a way that is not merely visual. The air itself seems violated. Bodies have not been honored, transformed or burned in the way older sacred logic demanded. They have been cast aside. They lie where defilement accumulates. The result is not only sadness, it is metamorphosis gone sick, flymen, disease, spiritual corruption taking material form. There are healers there, and that matters too. The existence of healers suggests that not everyone has abandoned care. Some remain close to suffering, trying to hold together what ritual negligence has allowed to collapse. Yet the larger lesson remains. In this world, death mishandled does not stay still. It breeds consequences. Improper burial becomes environmental heresy. When seen beside Enir-Ilim, the village becomes almost a dark mirror. Above, the sacred city transforms death into ash and growth. Below, neglected bodies bloom into insect ruin. One system integrates death, the other leaves it stranded. The contrast is quiet, but absolute. It tells us again that the Hornsent and their neighboring worlds understood mortality through a sacred economy, not through disposal. A corpse mattered after death. Its handling mattered. The world would answer differently, depending on what one did. This is important because when we later meet the jars, we are tempted to see only grotesque excess. The village reminds us that the logic beneath the excess is already present elsewhere. The body continues to matter after death. The remains continue to matter. Transformation is unavoidable. The only question is whether that transformation is framed as sacred, neglected, or corrupted. The jars are horrific because they claim to be sacred transformation. The village is horrific because it lacks it for a sleep story. This village works like a small cold place between larger sacred structures, a cautionary lowland under the shadow of higher right, a place where flies hum where once there should have been better silence, a place where the wrong kind of continuity takes hold. Even here, though, the story does not need to become sharp. We can keep it at a distance. We can let it remain what it is in the wider myth. A reminder that how a people treat the dead shapes what kind of world rises around them afterward. Now, we return to the more terrible form of sacred transformation. The shaman women of Marika's village stand at the darkest center of this whole theology. They are not generic mystics. They are specific bodies set apart for a specific use. They seem to evoke blind mediums, women whose relation to spirit, ritual and bodily permeability made them valuable to a system seeking to force separate lives into one sacred mass. Their flesh melded with others. That is the crucial and dreadful detail. If we try to understand the jars only through shock, we miss the full horror. The jars matter because they are doctrinal. They are not secret crimes committed in contradiction to Hornsent religion. They are expressions of it. The Hornsent believed in the sacredness of primordial intermingling. They believed nearness to the Crucible meant nearness to a state in which life had not yet been cleanly separated into individual bounded destinies. The jar ritual takes that belief and weaponizes it. It tries to manufacture, through force, a little private crucible, a saint-making chamber built from flesh, pain, and the shaman body as catalyst. The language of nigh sainthood is therefore sincere in the most terrible sense. The people conducting the ritual truly believe they are elevating the contents. They are not simply disposing of sinners, they are attempting transformation. Their cruelty is not empty sadism, it is a sacrament twisted by a cosmology that values merged life over individual mercy. Once this is seen, the jars become even more frightening. Horror, in the service of doctrine, is always deeper than horror without explanation. Imagine the ritual space. The air is heavy, the body is not treated as singular, flesh is opened, packed, forced together. The shaman woman is central not because she is honored as a person, but because her body allows the blending to take hold. This is the point at which the Hornsent theology reveals its sharpest edge. A civilization that worships entangled life too completely will eventually seek to produce entanglement by force. And yet it would be too simple to call the jars meaningless once we recognize their cruelty. The lore wants us to see that they mattered spiritually within that world. They were not empty gestures, something about merged life, something about the shaman flesh, something about repeated ritual intention, brought the Hornsent close enough to divinity that the logic of the divine gate later becomes imaginable. The jars are not the whole path, but they are part of the same path. They prepare the mind for the possibility that life fused together in sufficient sacred density can become threshold. This is perhaps why the jars are so difficult to forget. They belong simultaneously to anthropology, theology, and horror. They are relics of a people so sure of their sacred anthropology that they were willing to enact it upon living bodies. They become miniature towers of Babel in their own way, each one a private attempt to recreate the primordial abundance through violence. The tower reaches upward on a monumental scale. The jar reaches inward on an intimate one. Both seek the same thing, access through intermingled life to a higher sacred state. The sleep story version of this should not linger on pain. It should linger on the wrongness of conviction, turned beautiful in its own eyes. That is the most chilling thing. The old world did not look at these rites and see itself as monstrous. It saw itself as nearing heaven. Once the jars are understood, the divine gate ceases to be a strange isolated wonder and becomes the final architecture of the same logic. Enir-Ilim is already a city built around ascent. The shamans and jars provide ritual methods for forced intermingling. The tower's sacred ash recycles life upward. The spiral embodies the current of the crucible. The gate gathers all of this into one unbearable threshold. Flesh, life, sacrifice, sacred structure, all converge in a place where divinity can be crossed into or called down. This is where Marika enters. The pain of it lies in how successful the Hornsent were. Their civilization did not merely dream of access, it built it. Marika rises through the path they shaped. She becomes the god of a new age, and then later, the new age no longer honors the old builders. That is the Babel tragedy in its purest form. The tower works, heaven answers, but the answer is not belonging, it is dispersal, confusion, and later erasure. The gate itself is almost impossible to hold directly in the mind for long, because it sits at the crossing point between cosmic myth and ritualized body horror. It is a sacred threshold, made from the logic of merged life. That alone tells us that the Hornsents were not simply worshipping primordial life in abstraction. They were willing to shape divine access out of flesh. Marika's ascent, therefore, does not happen against their civilization. It happens through it. The later betrayal becomes all the more bitter because of that. Imagine the tower on the night or day or sacred hour when the ascent became possible. White bark, sacred air, ritual preparations, perhaps ash still drifting. Horned figures standing in attendance, the gate before them, too charged to be ordinary, too dense with meaning to be merely ceremonial. And then Marika, passing through what so many rites had prepared. A people looking upward and seeing their ambition fulfilled. It must have felt like proof that they had been right about everything, proof that their tower, their spiral, their theology, their rites, their sacred anthropology, all of it had touched the truth. And that is exactly why the later reversal hurts so much. If they had been wholly deluded, their downfall would be easier to process. But they were not wholly deluded, they were right enough to build a path. They were right enough to make a god's ascent possible. Their error was not empty falsehood, it was pride inside real contact. That is always more tragic. Marika's betrayal, therefore, is not simply conquest from outside. It is the severing of a ladder by the one who climbed it. The Hornsent made themselves useful to a new divinity, and that new divinity made them obsolete. The old sacred path had to be hidden, because the Age of Order could not remain stable while visibly owing its rise to a people, and a theology it would later reject. The Tower of Babel cannot remain open if the new heavens wish to pretend they arrived without it. No figure captures the Hornsent's spiritual failure more gently and more terribly than the Lamenter. His horns have overgrown and tangled until they blind him. Blindness in Elden Ring is almost never mere lack, it is often another form of contact, another form of exposure, another price paid for seeing too much. The Lamenter belongs to that lineage, yet he is marked not by doctrinal certainty, but by a state of true bliss and rapturous grief. That combination is unforgettable, bliss and grief, joy and lament fused so completely that they can no longer be separated. The Hornsent should have studied him. That line alone tells us how important he is. He is not merely a hidden monster or a side curiosity. He is evidence. He shows what their own path can produce when followed beyond the flattering stages. They loved horns as signs of chosen nearness, but the Lamenter shows what greater and more complete nearness might actually feel like. Not triumphal serenity, not social prestige, but overwhelming revelation, so intense that joy becomes indistinguishable from sorrow. Why did they fear him? Because he embarrassed their theology. He took their sacred sign too far inward. He became a living answer they could not fit into pride. The chosen people could celebrate horns while horns confirmed chosenness. But when horns blinded, when they forced another kind of sight, when the divine state became too ecstatic, too mournful, too excessive to remain socially useful, then the culture recoiled. The Lamenter became not a saint to honor, but a truth to hide. He is the Hornsent's most intimate Babel, a private tower collapsing inward into tears, a body that reaches too far and comes back, unable to speak ordinary happiness anymore. If Enir-Ilim shows the public shape of the civilization's ambition, the Lamenter shows its hidden emotional price. The path to heaven may not preserve the self in forms the self can enjoy. It may widen the soul until grief and rapture become the same undivided flood. That is why he belongs so centrally in a sleep retelling. He slows the story down. He draws us away from war and systems, and reminds us that hidden inside all of this is a private terror. That true contact with primordial divinity may not flatter anyone. The Hornsent wanted to be nearest the beginning. The Lamenter reveals that nearness may unmake the categories by which ordinary life remains bearable. So the Hornsent hid him, as they hid Midra, as they suppressed other internal revelations that made the path look less glorious than their public ceremony suggested. This is another deeply human pattern inside a deeply inhuman world. Religions often celebrate mystery until mystery stops supporting their self-image. Then the mystery must be put away. By the time Marika fully turns against the Hornsent, the outcome feels both shocking and inevitable. Shocking because the evidence suggests they once accepted her, perhaps even revered her, as part of their own ascent. Inevitable because a new age cannot remain stable while visibly indebted to an older and messier sacred system that contradicts its own claims to legitimacy. The realm is veiled, the tower is obscured, the old path is sealed into shadow. Those who built the ladder are removed from the main narrative of the world. The purge is felt in fragments, unsculpted keepers, broken lion dancers, curse blades reduced to defensive violence and eventual ruin. The Hornsent survive only as remnants, as displaced guardians, as ritual leftovers, as things one encounters in a hidden land already cut off from the bright surface of the Erdtree's age. Their chosen status is gone. Their primacy has been rewritten as deviance or archaic residue. The world moves on above them and leaves them to drift into myth. This is where Enir-Ilim becomes truly heartbreaking. It is not only a beautiful ruin, it is a successful sacred project whose success enabled the destruction of its makers. The tower worked, The rites worked, the path mattered, the god rose, and then the builders became a problem to be hidden. That is one of the cruelest stories Elden Ring tells, because it is not the story of pure failure. It is the story of achievement turned against its source. The chosen people of Babel are scattered, the chosen people of Enir-Ilim are veiled. In both cases, ambition does not simply fail, it reaches high enough to trigger its own undoing. That is why the codename matters so much. It gives us the emotional key before the lore gives us the mechanisms. This is a story of upward striving, answered by divine reversal. And still, there is dignity in the remnants. The tower stands. The ash remains, the deities still hold what they hold. The old signs of wildness continue to whisper through the shadowed land. Even betrayed civilizations leave shape behind. Perhaps that is why the DLC feels so haunted. We walk through the afterlife of a theology that truly touched the divine and was punished for the intimacy. Now the tower can begin to fade. Let Enir-Ilim stand pale and spiraling at the edge of the old world. Let the white bark hold its hush. Let the golden trees keep their fed brightness. Let the tutelary deities remain with ash in their palm. Let Red Bear forget his old name again somewhere in the wild. Let Ornis keep his wings in memory. Let the lion dancers go still. Let Hoarah Loux stand once more between storm and crown. Let the shaman women and the jars sink back into the dim religious dark, from which no one can now rescue them. Let the Lamenter remain where bliss and grief have become one undivided thing. Let Marika's ascent already be done. Let her betrayal already be old. Nothing in the tower can reach you now. The path is closed. The languages are already confused. The chosen people are already scattered into shadow and myth. What remains near you is only the feeling the story leaves behind. Pale spirals rising through dim air, horns catching the last little light, ash drifting over sacred terraces, and a high white city that once believed it could turn bodily nearness to the primordial into a road to heaven. If you wish, you can see the whole story now as a sequence of sacred images rather than as a puzzle. First, the pale tower in the distance, then the horns of a chosen people, then Thee, old wild bear and storm and bird, then Hoarah Loux before the crown sits too heavily on him, then the white bark and golden trees, then ash in old hands, then the jars in their terrible sincerity, then the divine gate, then the lamenter hidden in grief, then the veil falling over all of it. That is enough, more than enough for one night, so let the spiral loosen in the mind now. Now, let its turn become gentler and gentler, until it is only a motion upward, and then away. Let the highest stones disappear into mist. Let the old horns fall quiet. Let the ash settle. Let the tower keep what it keeps, and ask for nothing more of you. And let the whole ancient tale of Hornsent pride, wild divinity, sacred ash, jars, lamentation, and betrayal settle into rest like pale dust on the floor of a high sacred room no one has entered for a very long time.